What is the plurinational state of Bolivia? Do you want to know its history? Alright, then stay until the end of the video. Today we have the collaboration of my friend Orkari, on whose channel you can find great geography and history videos. I'll leave the link in the description. What is the plurinational state of Bolivia? The plurinational state of Bolivia dates back to the 11th century BC as evidenced in the Vizcachain site, although sedentary cultures would only be found around 2500 BC in what is known as the formative period. During this period, the Huancarana culture would appear, north of Lake Pohopo, characterized by the herding of camelids, which they probably worshipped. The Chiripa culture developed around Lake Titicaca in 3 periods, and it was characterized by its pottery and sculpture. But the most prominent pre-Hispanic culture would be the Tiahuanaco, which would also be divided into 3 periods. The villager, in which the culture remained occupying a small village. The urban, in which the village would become a large ceremonial city. And the imperial, in which it would leave its borders and expand to occupy a large part of the territory, as well as small extensions in Argentina, Chile, and Peru. The Tiahuanaco would have dominated bronze, which would give them a military advantage that allowed them to expand to border the Wari Empire in present-day Peru, with which there would be ideological and commercial exchange. With the decline of this state, Tiahuanaco would fall in the same way around the year 1200. The legacy of the Tiahuanaco remains, to this day, which stands out for its impressive archaeological works. Upon the disintegration of this empire, various ethnic groups would take their course. These would organize themselves into various Aymara kingdoms between Bolivia, Peru, and Chile, where the Aymara and Puquina languages would predominate. Among the kingdoms that developed in Bolivian territory are the Lupacas, Pacajes, Carangas, Zoras Charcas, Quilacas, and Colas. All these kingdoms, except the east, would be conquered one by one in the face of the rise of the Inca Empire, which, from Cusco, would begin the expansion under the command of the Inca Pachacutec, which would be continued by his son, Tupac Yupanqui. The conquest would be completed around 1480, with the kingdoms becoming part of the Collasuyo region, which, while now under Inca rule, the language and traditions, the Aymara tradition, would be maintained to this day. However, the Inca domination would be relatively short, as it would fall in 1533 at the hands of Francisco Pizarro, who would secure the subjugation of Collasuyo in 1535. By order of the King of Spain, the New World would be divided into governorships, in which the territory of present-day Bolivia would fall between the governorships of New Castile, under the command of Francisco Pizarro, and New Toledo, under the command of Diego de Almagro, who would found Oruro and Tupiza. Of course, in the context of civil war between the two conquerors, Almagro would be assassinated, and the following cities would be founded by Pizarro's adelantados, such as La Plata, future Sucre, Potosi, and La Paz. On the other hand, from the colonizing current of the La Plata River, other cities such as Santa Cruz de la Sierra would be founded. In 1542, the created governorships would be replaced by the Viceroyalty of Peru, which, at first, would cover most of the Spanish territories in South America, and for the administration of present-day Bolivia, the Audience of Charcas would be created in 1559. Over time, Charcas was divided into various intendancies and governorships, as it became one of the most prosperous and densely populated centers of the Spanish territories, especially because of the Potosi mines. Of course, accusations of labor exploitation of the indigenous people, despite the well-known laws of the Indies, were not long in coming. In 1777, the Viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata was established, incorporating the Audience of Charcas previously under the jurisdiction of the Viceroyalty of Peru, and it is precisely during these last decades of the 18th century when mining in Potosi begins a period of stagnation, mainly due to the exhaustion of the richest veins. With the well-known Bourbon reforms imparted from the 18th century, the encomienda system is reaffirmed, with which the mita and the indigenous tribute would be applied with greater rigor. And as every action has a reaction, indigenous uprisings would not be long in coming, such as those of Thomas Katari and Tupac Katari. External factors, such as the independence of the United States and the Napoleonic Wars, would influence the first cry for Bolivia's and America's independence during the Chuquisaca Revolution in 1809. At first, it was indeed the Spanish crown, but its intention was to trigger independence movements in other cities, like the Revolution of La Paz. Finally, the movement would be suppressed. Although many revolutionaries would be arrested, their ideas would influence the May Revolution in Buenos Aires, which began the emancipation process of the Rio de la Plata. The next outcry in Charcas would be the Cochabamba Revolution, which, although some victories were achieved, such as the Battle of Aroma, the Royalists would ultimately prevail in the Battle of Saipe. Faced with revolutionary chaos, the Viceroy of Peru, Joseph Fernando de Abascal, would reincorporate Charcas into the Viceroyalty of Peru, sending troops to contain the advance of independence, which complicated the independence process of Bolivia. Of course, such a valuable silver mine couldn't be lost that easily, right? Despite the Rio de la Plata expeditions for the liberation of Charcas, coupled with the resurgence of small republics, that is, independent guerrilla groups in Charcas fighting against the Royalists, the consolidation of Bolivian independence would be one of the most complicated in America, given that the Royalists would end up concentrating all their forces here. By 1822, the vast majority of nations in America had already gained independence, and it was not until Antonio José de Sucre's liberating campaign in 1825 when the Royalists were finally expelled, sealing the victory in the Battle of Tumuzla. In the face of such a hard-fought war of independence, Simón Bolívar would allow the Constituent Congress of Upper Peru to choose one of three options: to adhere to Peru, to the provinces of the Rio de la Plata, or to remain as an independent nation. The last option would win by an almost absolute majority, thus giving birth to the Republic of Bolívar, with Bolívar and then Sucre as president. Of course, after a short time the name would mutate to Bolivia, and well, young Bolivia would not be the exception in terms of political instability during its early years, which included a Peruvian intervention, which would end with the Bolivarian influence in 1828. Subsequent presidents ruled for short periods, until the rise to power of Andrés de Santa Cruz, a hero of the Wars of Independence. And here it is important to know the context of the also unstable Peru, in which after a civil war between Salaberry and Orbegoso, the latter backed by Santa Cruz for his unifying ideas of both countries, the Peruvian-Bolivian Confederation would be founded. This union was divided into three states: North Peru, South Peru, and Bolivia, and would be governed by Santa Cruz. Yes, he got his way. Some Peruvian sectors did not look favorably on this union, as they feared the weakening of Peru due to its division. So a war would begin against the Confederation, which apparently did not sit well with anyone, resulting in a restorative victory, with which the Confederation was dissolved. Meanwhile, Bolivian adversaries from Chuquisaca had supported the restorers, and of course, confrontations between supporters and opponents of the union with Peru would continue in the following years. This instability was taken advantage of by the president of Peru to try to annex the old Charcas, starting the Peruvian-Bolivian War, which of course would backfire on them. After this war, the Treaty of Puno would be signed, through which aggressions between both countries would cease and a possible union would be completely ruled out. Faced with so many wars, Bolivia entered a severe economic stagnation, in which it would be left without capital for the exploitation of the mines. A glimmer of hope would appear with the discovery of guano and saltpeter, deposits in Antofagasta which attracted foreign investments. Naturally, we provided them concessions, but with their corresponding taxes, which investors might not appreciate. And yes, you already know what will happen. Chilean protests, confiscation of foreign assets, Chile's invasion of Bolivian territory and activation of the secret alliance between Peru and Bolivia, and boom, Pacific War. A war in which Bolivia, without a navy and a prepared army, would be defeated, losing the department, and thus the access to the sea. Despite the defeat, Bolivia would achieve a period of democratic stability, initiated with the liberal government of Narciso Campero, in which the economy was based on the exploitation of tin. The stability would continue until 1899, in which President Pando, also a liberal, had to face a civil war against the conservative side, from which he emerged victorious, and the liberals would remain in power for 7 more governments. A new boom, which came with the exploitation of rubber, would also bring new conflicts, this time with Brazil. Faced with controversies over the sovereignty of the Acre region, rich in rubber and gold deposits, the Acre and Purus War would take place, in which, faced with an imminent war against Brazil and Peru, peace would be chosen with the city. Thus affirms the Treaty of Petropolis with Brazil and the Polo Bustamante with Peru. Around 1920, the liberal era culminated with the rise of the Republican Party to power. Yes, new parties would appear which would leave Bolivia behind the two-party system. Of course, the more parties, the more possibilities of political tensions due to dissensions. Political tensions would be followed by an economic crisis due to the fluctuations in the tin market, typical in countries that do not diversify. This is compounded by the government's high debt and the Great Depression of 1929. And as history tells us, when things go bad, they can get even worse. That's right. New territorial disputes with Paraguay would arise over control of the Gran Chaco, which had been an uninhabited region with an ambiguous colonial boundary, and whose treaties were never accepted by both nations. For Bolivia, this territory represented high geostrategic value, as it could provide access to the Atlantic Ocean. The war turned out to be the deadliest of the 20th century in America, as well as the deadliest in Bolivian history, with about 48,000 deaths. After 3 years of war that economically consumed both nations, the peace protocol was finally signed, after which the Chaco Boreal would be divided, and Bolivia would retain its access to the Paraguay River. In the face of general discontent over the disastrous results of the war, new instabilities would lead to the coup d'etat led by the hero of the Chaco, German Busch, who would first govern de facto, and in 1939 would establish himself as a dictatorship, during a period known as the transition between the old order and the revolution. The revolution would take place in 1952 under the Nationalist Revolutionary Movement Party, where the figure of Victor Paz Estenssoro stands out. During this revolution, the government would be overthrown and the MNR ruled for 12 years, achieving some political and social development of the country. Interestingly, it would be the only left-wing movement supported by the United States. But as nothing is eternal, the MNR was also overthrown by a coup to give way to the period of military dictatorship, with intermittent governments between René Barrientos and Alfredo Bando. Yes, typical in Latin America. And in the case of Bolivia, it would not be the exception to the emergence of guerrilla movements. In fact, Che Guevara himself would be captured here, in an attempt to establish himself in the heart of South America, and from where he could extend his guerrilla war throughout the continent. In short, apart from facing these guerrillas, the military government supplied the reopening of foreign investments in mining, and there would also be coups among them, like that of Colonel Hugo Banzer. In his regime, he suppressed the labor movement and their civil rights, until he would resign in 1978. Although a strong economic growth was achieved during the military period. With the fall in mineral prices in the 80s, a new crisis would begin. So well, if the military does a poor job, then the people want democracy. So from 1982, after overthrowing the last military junta, a period of democratic governments would begin. These governments, for the most part, faced the economic crisis with neoliberal policies. On the other hand, they would have to face the fight against drug trafficking, given that Bolivia had become one of the main exporters of basic cocaine paste. With no success in social and economic reforms, new indigenous, mining, and coca-growing social movements would emerge, All of this created the perfect environment for the rise to power of the Marxist left-wing leader, Evo Morales, whose policies would align with other leaders of socialism, Hugo Chavez and Fidel Castro of the 21st century. With the 2009 Constitution, the Republic of Bolivia changed its name to the Plurinational State of Bolivia. On the other hand, Evo implemented protectionist measures and nationalized various companies, managing to reduce extreme poverty. However, one of his most notable policies was to appeal to The Hague for a sovereign sea outlet, which was reported and denied. Despite this, Morales is running for a fourth term in 2019. And with this, we have come to the present. What do you think? Has Evo Morales' government been beneficial for the country, and does he deserve to be re-elected for a fourth term? Don't forget to leave your comment, and if you liked this video, support me with a like and subscribe to my channel. See you next time. Thanks for watching the video.